For those interested in independent watchmaking, Atelier Wen's Perception V3 brings together hand-turned guilloche dials by the workshop of Chang Yutsai and a highly customized French Pecquigny caliber EPM03, finished with Chinese cultural motifs and visible through full exhibition caseback. This high-performance movement also offers 65 hours of power reserve and chronometer accuracy. The 40mm 904L steel case is 10.4mm thick, offers 100 meters of water resistance, and comes on an integrated bracelet with a quick-release system and a patent-pending on-the-fly micro-adjustment. Available in ice blue, salmon, and a new bamboo green dial, Perception V3 combines craftsmanship, design, and wearability in one considered package. To learn more, visit atelierwen.com. That's ATELIERWEN.com. Now, back to the episode.
Hello and welcome to the Worn & Wound podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the editorial director at Worn & Wound. Really happy to be joined today by Worn & Wound contributor Cait Bazemore. Cait, how's it going?
Hi, I'm pretty good. Pretty good week so far, I guess.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. It's Monday afternoon at 3:00. So we haven't. So I mean, if we're doing okay so far this early in the week, I think that's a good sign. I have you on the podcast today to talk about, a couple of things, a couple of articles that you've recently prepared for us. One hit about a week or so ago about your experience with Citizen in Japan and a deep dive into their EcoDrive family of watches and those movements. And we're also going to talk a little bit about MB&F and a new release from MB&F, which if you're listening to this podcast, the moment it drops has been out in the public eye for like about an hour or so. And we'll have an article on the website and lots of photos and some cool content around that as well. Before we get into that, though, let's do a quick wrist check. Cait, are you wearing a watch? And if so, what are you wearing?
I am wearing a watch today.
Okay.
Getting better about that. And I'm wearing a watch that will shamelessly plug yet another pieces of forthcoming content that we have. So I am wearing one of the new Moser Streamliner minis that just came out at Watches and Wonders. This is the smallest version with a lovely kind of maroonish, purplish dial. And I am amid my official test drive of these pieces, both sizes, honestly, as well as an original size piece for comparison. And I'm really enjoying this journey so far, and you will be able to read more and see and hear more about it on our various platforms in the coming weeks.
Yes, coming to virtually every platform, I believe. We have a lot of plans for these watches, because I know you were a big fan of these. I know they were one of your favorite watches of the show, maybe of the year so far. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I was also really impressed with these watches. And I mean, just the fact that Moser made versions of really one of their flagship pieces in what is a traditionally ladies size, but didn't do the thing that a lot of brands do where they cut corners and use a quartz movement, or they kind of go halfway on the dial, or they really sort of these watches have a new movement, the same sort of high end. I believe it's a hand hammered enamel dial, if I'm not mistaken, that you see in the larger pieces. There are no half measures here. They really
totally.
Yeah. And can you share any initial impressions? I don't want to steal the review's thunder, but what can we sort of look forward to when you eventually write and talk about these more fully?
Well, even in the original proportions, I really love the design of the streamliner, and kind of across the board, I love a lot of what Moser does with their dials. So I think I went in just kind of expecting to love these pieces, and I do. However, I think the aspects that I'm appreciating after getting some dedicated time to wear them more than just try them on for a few moments in an appointment, new things that I didn't expect to appreciate have been emerging. So I'll maybe leave it at that and stay tuned to hear more about those things that,
that reveal themselves over time. Yes.
Yes,
Great.
that reveal themselves over time. Perfectly stated.
Great. Well, I'm definitely excited to hear more about those watches. Excited for the review, and so we'll look forward to that. I am wearing the Tipsum XLH, the Guide XLH, which is a I'll put it up on the camera here. This is like kind of their field watch. Basically, it's like a 36 millimeter watch with extra large hands and an extra large crown. They made like 5 of these last year. I was lucky to pick one up at Windup on the last day of Windup, New York City. They had one left. I was like, probably never going to have a chance to see this again. I like this watch a lot, so I took the punch. I really like it. It's a super comfortable, easy to wear watch with a like a traditional gilt dial with like the actual like the brass like surface of the dial base like exposed. It's not, like a gilt colored coating. It's like a true gilt dial, which is a subtle difference, but I think an important one. And I just really like this brand. I like this watch. So yeah, wearing that today.
I like it. I have to say I've done that a couple times, kind of like a end of show, now or never, like semi impulse purchase on a couple of watches before, and don't regret either of them. In fact, have gone on to love them, and like those were great decisions. So I think follow your heart in those moments.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, just gotta follow your heart, even if it means whipping out the credit card when you shouldn't otherwise do that. You only live once. You gotta go for those watches, especially when there's only 5 of them made. That was the thing.
Yeah, well, and both of mine were also limited edition pieces, and the question was asked, how many of these remain? And when I was told that number, which I'm gonna trust and believe those were the accurate numbers, they weren't just trying to give me the sell, I was like, okay, it's time. I need to just pull out, as you said, pull out the credit card on this one. So.
Figure it out later. That's a tomorrow problem. All right, let's talk about let's start with Citizen, Cait. So you wrote this really wonderful article about your experience in Japan with Citizen. You got like a tour of their manufacturer, their EcoDrive facilities, and I think we're exposed to to a lot of just like what Citizen like does at a very large scale. I think a lot of our readers will be familiar, listeners will be familiar with like Citizen watches, but like maybe not so much like a lot of the processes behind these watches. Before we get to like the nuts and bolts of the trip, I think it's like useful in these conversations to kind of start with like setting the table for like your like a baseline like press trip experience and like how this one might be different. Because I know just from like chatting with you, like this was not a typical press trip. So like you've been doing this for a while. We've both been doing this for a while. We've both been on our share of these things. How do you characterize sort of like the typical like watch industry press trip? So just we can like differentiate the Citizen trip from that.
Of course. So, I mean, I even think just kind of across the board, I would maybe go so far as to say there's 2 different kinds of press trips. And there's ones with much more smaller, fully independent brands. And then there are ones with perhaps brands that are part of one of the bigger groups, Swatch, Richemont, LVMH, that are typically producing at like a larger scale. And so I would say that is kind of a broad characterization of I have historically found, and this is not true for every brand within one of those groups. I could go off on a tangent about one brand within one of those groups that was a more atypical experience. But if I'm making some generalizations, I think those trips can be like a little more structured, kind of look the same outside of the nuances within the brand and the watches itself. Whereas I have had some very, I don't know, dare I say, like intimate press trips with smaller independent brands that literally, you know, I have a vision of one where it's that like very quintessential Swiss chalet kind of thing. And that was like where, I mean, unfortunately, they're no longer housed there because they have grown a bit bigger and have now gone into a more industrial facility. But at the time, they were in this extremely charming setting. And I feel that I literally met every person that worked there, like at the time, because it was just intimate is the best word that I can describe it. So I would say those have historically been kind of the two different flavors that I have experienced when it comes to like a factory tour press trip with a brand. Does that track for you?
Yeah, I think so. So like the thing that I totally agree. There's like, you definitely get like a more bespoke sort of experience when it's a smaller brand or an independent brand. And I think a lot of times the choreography of the experience itself is not like as apparent when it's a smaller brand. A lot of times it just feels more...
Choreography was an excellent word choice to describe.
Yeah, it just like, it feels more like they're kind of like figuring it out as they go sometimes, like in like a nice way.
Yeah,
like you don't feel as like...
Feels organic. It feels like they're meeting you where you are and you're meeting them where they are. And yeah,
sometimes like these things can be like a little stage managed.
Yes.
And that is, you know, that's fine. Like that is sometimes like very efficient and effective. And like, you know, exactly sort of like what sort of content you're going to get and what you're going to write about, but it's a less personal, you know, sort of experience. And I think like to your like your initial point, like you don't necessarily, you know, get to like have those sorts of like intimate conversations with people at the brand or your colleagues or whatever that can be so valuable on these trips. So and also like the other thing I'll say about like the factory tours, and I want to hear about your experience with Citizen, is like the thing that I always say, and that my, you know, I think some of my Warner Mountain colleagues would say, maybe you'll agree, is that like at a certain point, like all the manufacturer tours kind of feel the same. Like there's a lot of similarities. Like you see like the watchmakers in the white coats and the clean rooms, and you know, there's like a historical aspect that feels very kind of like familiar from brand to brand. And like sometimes I feel like there are no stories left to tell. Like everyone's sort of like, you know, they've done, you know, you've done JLC, you've done Longa, you've done, you know, a bunch of different, you know, Omega. Like they all kind of like, they tell a similar story specific to them, but it's you see a lot of the same stuff. And so I'm curious like how like Citizen was different, because obviously like this is based around EcoDrive, which is a newer technology, and it's, you know, we're talking about quartz watches here, and it's not like traditional, you know, like it's not traditional Swiss watchmaking, like the way that like a lot of us see it in our mind's eye.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I would say, and I think I was valid in making these assumptions going into the trip, is, you know, I established those two categories that I just kind of described to you, and knowing Citizen is quite literally one of the largest, like, global watchmakers, I assumed it would fall more into that category of the big brand, as you so perfectly described, kind of strictly choreographed and managed and orchestrated in that way. Like that is the assumption that I went in with. And I really couldn't have been more wrong in a lot of ways. And I would say I was actually blown away by the degree of like intimacy that was present despite the scale of their operation. So first of all, I believe, and you can reference back to my story, listeners, to fact check me on this, but I think it's 17 different facilities that they now have across Japan. And we did only visit 2 of them that were kind of specifically oriented to EcoDrive, which is not only the movement manufacturer, but also the dial manufacturer. Again, another kind of mind-blowing element that I was certainly not fully aware of is that the dial of EcoDrive is really just as important as the movement technology that they've created, because that movement can only work if light can permeate the dial. But in a very typical Japanese watchmaking sense, like the aesthetics of the dial are still very important, and like how do we negotiate that functionality with still creating something that is beautiful. But yes, as you said, there were some of those very kind of typical, and we've seen this before, kind of aspects of the factory tour. The people in white coats working at a bench with loops and various tools and all of that. But, a lot of times interaction with those people is not encouraged. If you want to have a conversation, if you want to grab a quote, if you want to clarify something, you're encouraged to note that question down, and it, to have it be given to the appropriate person who has been authorized to go on the record to answer that question. And here, even with a language barrier, we were equipped with translators at all times and encouraged to speak to anyone and ask any question every step along the way. And that warmth and transparency, again, at a brand of this scale. And, I think we can't have this conversation without mentioning also not just the scale, but the price point. Like this is not super high-end 6-figure luxury pieces. Like I expected this to be like a big corporation, and such a machine. And the level of, like I said, just like warmth and the very personal experiences and interactions that we were able to have, like truly astounded me. It was very unexpected. And to that end, I also expected machinery to be at the forefront, and for people to not be so much at the forefront. Again, between, as you said yourself, like much more quartz technology present as opposed to mechanical, like we expect from a lot of Swiss watchmakers. I expected much more industrialization. I expected much more conversations about the machining that they were using, and that was a part of it. But the number of people who were still working at those benches, the number of things that are still hand done on Citizen's timepieces was also truly astounding to me. And again, I know in my story, I may not retain all of them off the top of my head, but I have some actual like facts and figures about, the average number of hands that touch a particular EcoDrive model, at least. I'm sure EcoDrive is a higher standard within their product line. So I'm sure that maybe there is less of that at some of the lower end product lines. But yeah, I get like literally like don't judge a book by its cover. I went in with a lot of assumptions that were based on experiences that I'd had, but really found something different in my experience there.
Yeah, I think so. A point that you make about like the dial being so integral to the watchmaking itself, I think is an important one that like we shouldn't gloss over. I mean, obviously, like dial making is like is an artisanal aspect of watchmaking that goes back centuries, literally. And the dial for many people like is the watch, like it's the central thing that they're like, purchasing a watch for. It's a thing that you really kind of like fall in love with the watch based on. And I think what's interesting about EcoDrive that you highlight in this piece is that it's not just it's not just like an artisanal object. It's also like a technical object because of the way the movement works. And that's not really the case in traditional watchmaking. It is like solely a artistic object in traditional watchmaking. And it has to be, it can't be too thick. It can't be too heavy. There are certain things that like you have to like, do to make a dial properly, but it's not a piece of technology in the same way that an EcoDrive dial is. And what I think is really interesting is like I've owned a number of EcoDrive dials, like EcoDrive watches over the years, and like it's not like obvious that these dials are like EcoDrive dials, because obviously they need to have like a certain amount of light has to be able to pass through them, as you point out.
A certain amount of like transparency, essentially.
Yeah. So like, what did you learn about how they accomplish that without making a dial that like to the naked eye looks like something that is like transparent, that light can pass through?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has been a simple feat, especially broadening range of colors, textures, designs, even different materials for the dial. Those were a couple of the dedicated people that they had set us up to speak to at the dial factory. There was one, and again, I'm sure I'm not entirely correctly quoting his tenure, but I believe it was something like close to 20 years that he had been working on the dials. And even he himself, shared that being able to expand the stylistic range, like to your point, as would be very possible with lacquer or enamel or, the typical materials we think of when it comes to creating the variety of dials that most brands possess, that simply, again, kind of being able to meet that aesthetic standard has taken a lot of research and development and trial and error. And that even when they've kind of homed in on the materials that work with the EcoDrive movement technology, that like the simple changing of pigmentation can kind of, I mean, I think take you back to square one is like a strong statement, but can take you back several steps in the design process. And I think, one of the more interesting examples of a piece that, again, ties deeply to the culture of watchmaking that they are still trying to uphold is the washi paper dials that have newly come to the collection. And that was the second dial expert that we spoke to. Like that was kind of his particular area of expertise. And, I think them being able to figure out how to use a paper like that again gets to represent the culture, but like opened up kind of a whole new world for them in terms of stylistic elements of the pieces. So yeah, I just, what has always drawn me to watches is this negotiation between like the practical and the technical and the artistic and the aesthetic. And I think that is just so deeply embodied in the EcoDrive watches.
Yeah, that's well said. Those washi paper dials are so impressive. Like anytime I get a chance to see one of those, I have a friend in the watch community here in New Hampshire who owned one of the original, like an early washi paper dial, like back in the, like 2018, 2019 or so, I think is when I first saw one. And they were like JDM, like, watches at the time. And I remember he had to like import it, into the United States. And it was like not easy to get. And it's really beautiful, and it's just such a cool way that like Citizen had addresses that EcoDrive, that inherent problem of like light passing through the dial, like creating a dial that allows for that, while also being like deeply relevant to Japanese culture. It's just a really, really cool solution. And they're incredibly beautiful, and there's like real craft involved in in making those dials.
Yeah. And I think to just, we don't need to go down a whole rabbit hole of this, but I think something else just worth mentioning that really stood out to me about this experience overall was this was my first press trip really outside of a European brand. And that was, an eye-opening experience for me as well. I think I've gotten cued into the fact and needing to kind of acknowledge that my vantage point in this industry has been a little bit like limited and streamlined more to European brands, obviously Swiss, but as well as French and German and, you know, even British. And, you know, yes, obviously like Grand Seiko, like I'm very, you know, I'm familiar with a lot of these Japanese brands, but there is a different experience of entering the culture there. And even though there are going to be kind of through lines and similarities in watchmaking from a practical perspective all across the board, but just to see that micro like differences in attention to detail and like what, you know, precision means, again, as it relates to both technical and aesthetic execution. And, you know, the culture really does come through in their processes and to me in the watches themselves. And honestly, like I think I need more of those experiences to have a more kind of holistic view of what is happening in this world of horology that is, you know, definitely not just limited to kind of European or American approaches to the craft.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that like no matter how many years you spend in this industry or just as a watch enthusiast or collector in general, like it's impossible not to have blind spots. Like nobody is able to like access everything all the time. Like you're always going to have, you know, like parts of the hobby or parts of the industry, however you approach it, that you're just not as familiar with. And, you know, we all have our like biases and also things that we're like, where we have like, you know, strength, like Worn and Wound, you know, like we, you know, we've always been a, you know, publication that sort of like caters to the like accessible and the, you know, and like microbreads. Like I might be a little bit, you know, like bias isn't the right word, but just like sort of like, you know, inclined towards those watches. And I love like the higher end stuff, but I'm not as knowledgeable, you know, about some of the higher end stuff. I have a, you know, genuine curiosity about it and, you know, and want to learn. And it's the same with, you know, anyone who's, you know, exposed to traditional European watchmaking, Swiss watchmaking, and then discovering, you know, Japanese watchmaking and the unique culture around that. And I think like you bring up an important point that it's just like, it's important to be open-minded about these things and to approach, you know, like different aspects of the community with like a real curiosity. I want to ask you about like some of those like cultural experiences. You spent, you know, I think like 2 weeks total in Japan, or maybe
It
even a
wasn't
little
quite
bit.
2 weeks.
Okay.
It was like 10 days. But yes, I think that brings up a really important point of, you know, we've talked about some of these, again, kind of like at the factories themselves and what was similar and what was different compared to other press trips. But I would say the thing that made this trip completely unique from any other trip that I've been on was this length of time that we had and the level of thoughtfulness and intention to have us experience that culture, but in ways that very much tied to the brand's approach to watchmaking. You know, like for instance, again, something that might just seem very simple and quintessentially Japan, like we did a sake tasting at one point, but speaking with the experts who I have, again, like I had a little bit of this correlation of I've dabbled in some wine coverage in my journalistic career, and I immediately connected with it because the nuances and like the nerdery of it are really so parallel to watchmaking. And so we found like these same kind of parallels and points of connection as these experts described like the sake making process and the different regions and, you know, how different regions like approach the process. That to me was, and I'm not saying like in some of the Swiss press trips that there's not been any aspects of Swiss culture integrated into them, but I think the extent to which Citizen wanted to not only emphasize its products and its watchmaking processes, but the culture that has informed those throughout the long tenure that this brand has existed. And again, shameless plug, we'll be seeing another story from me that kind of gets more into these cultural experiences that I'm speaking of. So yeah, that to me is just one of the things that absolutely set this trip apart from really any other that I've been on before.
Yeah. I have to admit, I'm kind of jealous. Wish I've never been to Japan. I've always wanted to go. It's like truly kind of like, like a bucket list destination for me. So it sounds like I know you had a great experience there. You shared with me some what's to come in that sort of like cultural experiences piece that you're working on. So that'll be great. And just really glad we were able to kind of like chronicle this trip in this way. Obviously, we'll leave a link in the show notes to your article on the Eco Drive experience that you had. But yeah, just like it sounds like just a really fantastic experience all around.
It was. I mean, it's in a honestly like top 3, if not top 2, like press trips that maybe even the top 1. I don't know, but it's very high up there.
There's a content idea. Everyone's top 3 press trips. We can rank them on like hotel accommodations and food and travel. Like there's a lot of possibilities.
Well, hotel accommodations definitely sways another trip that was really, really up at the top for me. But I think if we do that story, it would be interesting to survey people from like different eras too of watchmaking, because
sure.
A lot of the older guard I hear talk about like back in the day, like
Same.
This happened on press trips, and I'm like, okay, I wasn't privy to that, but sounds interesting.
I'm realizing I got in late and missed a lot of the missed a lot of the really kind of like true luxury. Like I mean, listen, like I've experienced some luxurious press trips, but like the stories I've heard, which I'm sure you have too,
but not just like luxury. It was like bizarre locations and stuff too. Like that. Like that's something that has really stood out to me. Is they would be like, and we touched down in like this place that felt totally random, and I was like, why were you there? And they were like, we don't know, but that's just where they held the trip. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Listen, this is the kind of inside baseball content people love, is talking about these like incredibly random, insidery experiences. But I think, listen, it's an interesting facet of this industry, the way that brands kind of like expose the people who cover them to their, like perspective and worldview. And I think it's worth kind of like talking about it, not just from like the brand's perspective, but like how we interpret it and like how it sort of like relates to everything else. I think it's important to be like kind of open and honest about that, and to understand that it's like often sort of like a fantasy world and not reflective of, like the real lives of, normal, average, everyday people. So yeah. Speaking of normal average watches and everyday people, I want to switch gears to MB&F and their latest.
Yes, definitely 2 ends of the watchmaking spectrum to discuss here.
Yeah.
So yes, as you said at the top, a mere like hour or so ago at this point, we have kind of the first official timepiece from Max Maertens, who is the new kind of protege of Max Büsser. And he's done some of the brand's like horological objects before, but we have today his first wristwatch. And as I say in the first graph of my story, sort of, because it is also able to transform into a horological object.
Mm-hmm.
So it's technically the HM, but we get the HM12 Guardian, and the Guardian is this robot who the case of the watch transforms into the robot's head, and that's where your watch case can live when it's not on your wrist. And got to have a look at this new duo at the brand's brand new New York City lounge, it's interesting. I specifically clarified, I was like, what are we calling this? And it's like the New York City Lounge. I think it tends more towards the Mad Lab than the Mad Gallery. However, we still get a lot of the interesting art pieces and the brand's horological objects that will kind of be on rotation. It's just maybe not the same extent and degree as the Mad Galleries. But yeah, wild stuff from them.
Yeah, so I got a chance to see this in Geneva during Watches and Wonders week. We always have a meeting with MB&F, and we're always very excited to see whatever it is that they are going to like tease. They always have something like coming in the future that like they want to show us. And so we met with with the team, and Max was there. Max Maertens was there to describe his creation, and he's going through the kind of like a preamble, kind of like giving us some background, and that like he hasn't shown it to us yet. And there's this like object with a covering over it, and we're all just like, I mean, obviously there's like something dramatic like under this like black sheet, and then he uncovers it, and it's just like, do you remember? You know how tall it is, like in terms of like it's huge. Like I don't
remember
dramatic.
How tall it is, but it's like a foot tall. I would say
it's a big object, and I'll say this. It's bigger than an object you expect to see in a watch meeting. Like you expect to see a watch. So it's like, you expect to see a wristwatch, and you see instead this like wristwatch that's mounted, a pretty large robot, which is essentially like, when the watch is placed on it as the head, it becomes a clock. So it's basically like a wristwatch and a Lapie clock. And it's, there's a whole story behind it. The Guardian, robot, all of the campaign for this watch ahead of the release was funny because like they're trying to like not give too much away, but like they give everything away. Like there's like, it's obvious like that this is, I think people, if they put their heads, if they really thought about it, they'd figure out like exactly like what this is. But it's it's a robot that's holding in one hand a torch, a UV torch. And then what's in the other hand? Is it it's
a loop.
It's a loop, right? A loop.
Yeah, the loop that kind of looks like a shield.
Right, exactly. And then there's also a space at the base of the robot that he stands on for the straps, because obviously you take the straps off, so you can mount the watch, as the head, and then the straps have a quick release, mechanism. So it's like it's very easy to like put on and take off. It's just like a very cool kind of like over the top object. It's a tourbillon, of course. The tourbillon is the head, is the brain, which I think is fun. And it's just it's like exactly the kind of like whimsical sci-fi influenced MB&F object that I think a lot of people really love about this brand. And like maybe they've like gotten away from a little bit in the last few years. This is like a pretty brazen like thing, like much more so than I think anything that they've like released in at least like the last like couple of years that I can recall. Is that sort of like your like impression of this as well?
I would agree with all that. The one thing that I would again emphasize, just as I took an opportunity to do when we were speaking about Citizen and EcoDrive and their dials and the movement technology, is that same push and pull between aesthetics and the practical technical components was so much of what has brought this HM12 Guardian to life as well. I mean, if you take just the watch itself, and again, you can kind of read more of the details of this in my story, but there's the movement that's powering the watch and the tourbillon and all of that. But then there's also this face shield that is part of part of the movement as well. It's in 3 colors that the watch is offered in. And this is purely aesthetic. Right. There's totally no other reason for this other than just a playful function. You can, bring it out and draw it into different degrees to where it's like fully activated in a lot of color to just like little peaks of color. But it makes up, again, I'm not always great at quoting my own statistics, but I believe it's 1/3 of the movement components were like just dedicated to this purely aesthetic face shield to bring some color and enhance the facial qualities of the robot. They had 2 movement makers that kind of had to work in tandem, negotiating and marrying these 2 objects together. Then take a step out further. Lots of friends were involved in this as well. We have Kari Voutilainen doing some finishing on the movement. We had Lepe, who's been kind of their long-term partner in developing some of the more clock-like objects. But in tandem was Lepe working on the sort of robot himself. But, you know, we needed to make sure that the head was very secure, and the way that the lugs, you know, are refined to be able to fit this head onto the body, the case onto the robot. And, you know, as they described it as well, like there was a lot of working in tandem. It wasn't like one was done and we designed it around the other. There was a lot of collaboration in negotiating the look that they wanted to achieve that fit the concept and the story they wanted to tell, but also make every component functional, user-friendly, all of that. So I think once again, we have a very wild and wacky example of sort of, you know, the mechanics and the artistry.
Yeah. It's just something I really like admire about MB&F is the seriousness to which they take something that is like so inherently silly, and like they know it's silly, and like, but they also know that like they're really good at like executing on these things. Like they're the best in the world at like this type of like avant-garde. There's no one else like doing exactly like this sort of watchmaking, and like they kind of like push the boundaries with every release, it seems. So yeah, very, very cool. It's not cheap. It's like $350,000, which
and very limited production. They were emphatic. Like, so I did have some one-on-one time with them in the New York City lounge, but it began with like a group kind of unveiling with several other journalists. And there were at least 3 or 4 of us that tried to find different ways to ask the question, like, would you do this again, but maybe in this way? Or like, would you maybe, you know, never do the robot again, but make a different watch whose head could exchange onto it? And they were like very emphatic. They were like, no, they were like, this was a labor of love and a beautiful passion project, but it was not cheap to execute. You know, they claim they're like hardly making any margin like on this, even with a very high price tag. And they were like, yeah, like this was kind of a project of like crazy people, and like, no, we will never be doing this again. So
you point out in your article that it's like the most complicated like object clock that like Lepi has made. So like part of the way I see this is like, you know, Max and team just spending years collaborating with Lepi, just trying to break them, and like maybe this is the thing that finally did it.
It was like time out.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a really cool project. You know, if folks can you know, have a chance to like get to you know, the MB&F lounge or a mag gallery and like see this thing in person, like obviously like they're gonna be like, they're quite rare, but like maybe they'll have enough like watch time in the fall, or you know, they'll be, you know, on display somewhere. Like, but like it's if you like this stuff, it's worth seeing in person and like and handling the watch and clicking it into the head. It's like it's a pretty cool thing. So obviously we'll have links to our coverage of the HM Told Guardian in the show notes as well. Thanks for covering that for us, Cait. It's a solid article, a good interview with Max too. We have some good quotes. You got some good quotes from him,
I really enjoyed kind of getting into his mind and creative process and design process, and you know, how he's inspired by MB&F and Max Buser and everything that has been done, but kind of, you know, what he also brings to the table. And I think, you know, we're going to see the brand's DNA remain consistent, but you know, it's always interesting when kind of new creativity can come on board and add a little fresh splash into things too.
Yeah, for sure. My impression of chatting with him in Geneva is that like he seems like very aligned with like Max Busser's vision, like for the brand.
Yeah.
Like there's, it's like sometimes you want your colleagues to be like a contrast, to your, to your like philosophy of design and outlook, and that, produces a certain type of creative energy. It seems to me like Max and Max have a certain like similar kind of like way of like viewing this stuff, and so it'll be interesting to see like how his work sort of like develops within MB&F from that perspective. So yeah, very exciting stuff. Cait, we're at the end here. I asked you to come prepared with a cultural recommendation for our listening public. What have you got for us this week?
I had a very immediate answer of something that has been like prominent in my life right now. And I've wavered back and forth because I feel it is going to be so irrelevant to a majority of the audience. Whatever. I'm just going to roll with it. I'm just going to roll with it anyway. It's going to be kind of feminine leaning and just absolutely not watch related in any respect. So, I'm a poet as well. I've come on here and kind of plug poetry and literature and things like that. So one of my favorite authors, Melissa Broader, who started as a poet, but she's actually gone on to write across all genres. Her novel, The Pisces, is a great summer read, kind of fantasy. There's a merman character in the mix, and that's a great summer read. But why she is top of mind for me right now is she used to have this amazing podcast called Eating Alone in My Car. That's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. She lives in LA.
Great title for a podcast.
Amazing. That ran from, I think, about 2018 to 2022, was devastated when it ended, have listened to the entire podcast series through multiple times. But she has recently started a Substack and brought back Eating Alone in My Car as a portion of the Substack. So that is what I am here to plug today. But again, let it be known, as you can probably get a taste of, poet and novel she wrote has a merman as one of the main characters. This is some weird, girly kind of woo-woo, and she's eating a lot of girly kind of food in her car. So, might not be for the average listener of this podcast, but nonetheless, I'm here for the weird ladies like me who might be listening.
Listen, I hope, as we talked about earlier, I hope that the average listener of this podcast keeps an open mind and is intellectually curious about things that they might not otherwise be exposed to. So of course we'll leave a link to the Substack in the show notes, and folks can explore that. It's always good to have a summer reading recommendation, and so yeah, thanks for that, Cait. My cultural rec is also kind of like right in my wheelhouse. So, you're gonna like live in yours. I'm gonna live in mine. So I've got a movie recommendation. And also like a streaming channel recommendation, which I've plugged on here before. But I noticed, with the new month, of course, all the streaming services were like refresh their lineups, and the Criterion channel, which is like my favorite streaming service. It's the streaming channel of the Criterion Collection, of course, the iconic line of like DVDs and Blu-rays, like special director approved editions and so forth. They started streaming one of my favorite movies from the 90s, The Game, by David Fincher, starring Michael Douglas, and they've got the whole Criterion like special edition on their streaming site, so you can watch the movie with the director's commentary. There's a lot of behind the scenes footage, the documentaries and so forth that you have access to. Just a great movie. Kat and I did a time on screen episode about a month or so ago on Zodiac, David Fincher's film about the Zodiac murders and the investigation. And this is another great David Fincher movie set in San Francisco. So if you liked that episode of Time on Screen, or like the movie Zodiac and haven't seen The Game in a while, or have never seen it, it's streaming on the Criterion channel. And just subscribe to the Criterion channel if you love movies. It is like the best kind of like repository for like important like classic films and foreign films and like interesting independent films from like the current era. It's just great. And The Game is like rarely streaming on any service, so like sometimes I notice that it's popped up somewhere, and it's just a really fun 90s thriller. So that's my rec.
Love it.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening. As always, we appreciate it, and thank you, Cait, for joining me on the podcast. It was great to have you on again.
Thank you for having me again.
Of course, anytime. We will be back next week with another episode of the podcast. I think we're doing a Q&A next week. I might ask you to come back.
Fun.
Kate,
I would love to rejoin that. Those are super fun.
Okay. Yeah, I think if it's not next week, it'll be the week after. But in any case, there's a Q&A episode coming. There's always an episode coming. We don't miss a week. Very rare that we miss a week. So we'll see you again very soon. And until then, take care.